while we wait for some questions from the audience, and I mean, I'm sure everyone must be collecting their thoughts around some of the provocations that have come out, I sort of wanted to, I think, again, have like an overall sense of some of the ideas that you proposed, Dr. Sawhney, mainly the aesthetic and ethical considerations of the role of the artist in society. So, the artist as a participator in civil society, as well as the artist's role in, and this again ties into some of those older ideas about productivity, deeply, associated with the artist. So, does the ethical responsibility of the artist fully rely on the kind of productive role that they play in society? And of course, these are some of the ideas that are echoed in Hitaku's essay as well, where it's the moral and ethical responsibility of the artist to therefore present a particular idea. Um, as we think about how that ties into a kind of urgency that we feel at this current, in our current contemporary moment, I wanted to sort of ask, what you feel about the sort of issues around, say, what we have around the truth or the post-truth moment, in a sense. So, of course, like there are ideas around documentary and creative documentary, wherein there is a particular uh, play, an association with the truth value, so to speak. Or you have the documentary as a form that seeks to recreate and therefore present something almost evidentially, but also beyond that. So right now, of course, we are in a time where there is a proliferation of videos, in a sense. If I were to just take one example, that are, say, quick captures. So you have smartphone videos and you have these quickly produced stuff, amateurly captured and then shared onto, say, social media, that sometimes accounts for or becomes the only documents that we have for a particular sort of moment, or to counter the state or hegemonic narrative around an event. And we've seen quite a lot of that happen in, of course, some recent events that have taken place. So I suppose, in a slightly fragmented manner, what I wanted to ask is, do you see some of those sort of quick turnaround? And of course, there is the idea of the, it's escaping my mind right now, but surveillance aesthetics is one part of it, but also how these citizen produced videos, in a sense, or that seem to be coming from the collective civil society. Do you see some of those also translating in, say, works from the mid 2000s, let's say, ever since, like, this sort of the from the video magazine to, television broadcast, to now we have WhatsApp forwards that have a lot of such material circulating. So I guess I just wanted to get some of your ideas around.
Yeah, so I think there are multiple strands through in your question. And one thing that I just kind of want to briefly comment upon, that, with every new generation, the memory of the history of technology kind of seems to be getting erased, right? So I think that is one peculiar kind of challenge that we face, where uh, video enters India, television enters India in 1959, but doesn't become popular in households until much later. And although video enters is used widely in other parts of the world through the 70s, it's only through the late 1990s, and actually the beginning of the 21st century, where it really becomes a technology that is used widely through the 1990s, right? So I think there are different temporalities to the history of technology in different parts of the world. So it would be difficult to kind of give a generalized response to that. I also kind of like to think of, so the third part of the third section in the book is actually about the citizen as artist. And we also lost Gadar recently, and he was a very influential figure in the use of folk music and folk forms. in the claim for citizenship in the creation of Telangana. And there is an article in the book by S.V. Srinivas that looks at how folk enters the mediated world of multimedia and becomes a way to legitimize political claims on grounds of cultural uniqueness across the same shared language, but a cultural specificity that Telangana has that Andhra doesn't, right? So artist as citizen is one part of one section in the book, and the next one is actually citizen as artist. So I think some of what you're referring to is captured there. I also like to think of now increasingly in a much longer historical sense of the moving image or of images in a longer historical sense. And I think that we are moving towards a heightened and more intensified desire for disembodiment, right? So I tend to see both photography and cinema and video and digital images, the mobile phone, etc., along a longer trajectory towards human disembodiment that begins with the printing press, and if not earlier. So the spoken word is disembodied through the written word through print, and the voice is disembodied through the gramophone. So all recording, they all technologies of recording and circulation in some sense. Um, it seems to me, and this is a speculative kind of argument that I have, which I need to substantiate and fully work out, that we are actually now disembodying not just physical, biological senses, but the capacity for thought itself, right? And memory. So when you do look at artificial intelligence or even USB, whatever memory storage devices, etc. Uh, we seem to be in a transformative phase as human beings. And while the relationship between images to the human species is much longer, as we discussed, 30,000, 40,000 years old, uh, how it takes form is enacts itself in a different way at different historical periods vis-a-vis technology. So that's not an answer to your question, but I think the kind of video moment or the digital mobile phone moment is also a transitionary moment that we will quickly pass through and reach elsewhere.
I mean, I do find it quite interesting because also in the beginning of the talk, you had, like you mentioned, reference the NFT and, these sort of vastly regenerative sides of artistic production in a sense, and how, that can still tie into, again, like the idea of the artist and a certain kind of productivity associated with it. So yes, I mean, the long durée of media history, so to speak, does feed into each other in that sense. We had one question from Satavisha, who says that the talk reminded her of a lot of discussions that they have in the classroom. And their question is, as a citizen subject, can the artist ever prioritize any sense of inclusivity? I am just curious about it, as I believe the significance of voice holds a central role in discussions about citizenship, as the concept of citizenship being a mode of civic involvement and expressive interaction is closely tied to the matter of engagement in societal and cultural domains.
As a citizen subject, can the artist prioritize sense of inclusivity? So yeah, hi Shatasha, thanks for joining. Good to have you here. I think the point I was trying to make is that when one uses the term artist as citizen, one is doing so with the awareness that both terms come with their own different histories. And so when I said that I'm using it in a metonymic way in some sense, where one begins to stand in for the other through a performative act, through a performance, I think that necessarily indicates the need to think about questions of how does one connect the individual self with the wider social world, right? And that itself implicates or implies some questions around this idea of inclusivity. So I don't know if this answers your question, Shatasha, but Your question is always longer than the answer. So I've never been able to answer them in class either. So
Okay, we also have another question from Dr. Shweta Sachdeva. She has a couple of questions. The first is about the difference between the relationship between the visual image, film, videos in the 90s and now. Not so much about production of these images, films and videos, but the reception or spectatorship as we move away from multiplexes to a phone or consumption as an individual in isolation. My second question is, at one level, I think of the multiple possibilities, how this space is being shaped anew through the Dalit camera or the Pari network and other platforms. And yet I increasingly feel an anxiety about the use of fake videos and the role of AI. And she would like to know your thoughts.
yeah, so I'll respond to your first question. The difference between the relationship between films or videos in the 1990s and now, and I think this is a really important shift because cinema, as opposed to literature, which was always a private consumption, you did not read books collectively, right? Audiobooks maybe make it possible to listen to a book in with your friends, but literature was a exclusively personal act, and cinema changes that because it you have to watch, people were watching images in groups. It was not a one-on-one relationship, and that enabled a certain kind of sociality which was crucial, because it was not just about the film as text itself, but it was about all the sociality that went around, that was involved with the act of going to a theater and watching a film, which became an event in some sense that preceded and lasted after the screening itself is over. That changes radically in the context of OTT platforms and people watching films on laptops and videos. However, there is still a kind of networked sociality that arises through acts of sharing, circulation, commenting. So YouTube, for example, is a big repository of films and videos, right? So new forms of online communities get formed, which of course don't have the same effect as the sociality of theatrical, particularly single screen viewing. But I might just be like a old romantic with respect to this. As to your second question, which is, I'm just trying to find your question here. Multiple possibilities of this space as being shaped through Dalit Camera, the Pari network, and other platforms. Um, yes, I think, I mean, it's been a very liberating, democratizing force. And in this second section, artists as citizens, some of the kind of key, developments that take place through the 80s is the forming of film collectives, even earlier with celluloid collectives, but here now with kind of, more women getting into filmmaking because the technology becomes lighter and easier to operate, and so on. So I think with mobile phones, that it really opens up an entire new world in terms of what people can do with their cameras in some sense. However, uh, we must realize that our images on our mobile phones are completely meaningless to the larger world unless they exist within a assemblage or a digital platform. And those digital platforms have physical infrastructures. There are servers and you know optical, whatever cables to transmit the network and so on, right? So there is still a huge physical network, and there are people who control these networks. So it's not as if the digital has suddenly made all that is material vanish into thin air, as uh, some have said, right? But we still exist in that relationship between physical infrastructure and the digital um, ephemeral. So I think while it democratizes the possibilities of image production, the circulation and what is accessible to whom are still being controlled. So it's not really as democratic as we would like it to be.
had a couple of more questions. So Shivani wanted to ask if you could share your thoughts on the conception of cultural citizenship in the current moment, particularly in the sphere of contemporary art, where the national framework has largely been superseded by a post-national or the global contemporary.
All right, thanks, Shivani. I mean, I would actually be very delighted if it had been superseded by post-national or even a global contemporary. Maybe in the art world, the global contemporary is a conceptual category that has had significant influence. But I think we are regressing more and more into a national framework rather than moving towards a post-national framework. And that really is kind of worrying because, as we know, that nationalism again is idea that emerges at a particular historical period because of specific forces and so on. Um, and as you know, also, if we talk in the context of South Asia or India, we really struggle to be a nation, right? I mean, we are really a region rather than a nation. So, your thoughts on the conception of cultural citizenship. I think that's a great idea, although the word culture itself is open to debate in terms of what it means. And there is another question from Tanya Singh who says, as an art historian, I just want to clarify that I'm not an art historian. I do cultural studies and I do film studies, so I don't know what that makes me. Uh, so, kind of mongrel, I suppose. But therefore, I have spent a considerable amount of time thinking about this question of culture and what it means. And at least within cultural studies, we kind of like to think of it as, flowing through mechanisms and systems of power in some sense. So, yes, I would be delighted if we could actually not just look at a post-national, but really a federal and regional conception of the region in some sense.
Just would you like to respond to Tanya's question about the democratic values that are often perceived as utopian in nature and the potential existence of a more radical artistic vision? I think this is like based off of some of those ideas on the formation of the artist as citizen itself.
Yeah, potential existence of a more radical artistic vision. And I would really like to know from Tanya what she has in mind when she talks about this more radical artistic vision, because of course we know from history that, there have been such visions, right? And one example, there are many, but one example is really to hold our institutions responsible in some sense. And in an article, for a journalistic article that I'd written recently about the Ambani Cultural Center in Bombay, I had drawn upon the example of, some guerrilla artists in the gag collective in New York, which actually held the Museum of Modern Art responsible by demanding that they auction artwork worth some $1 million and use it to distribute the money to people who uh, were in need of finances. So I think the question of what is the purpose of art really kind of needs to be asked. And I'm not at all trying to reduce it to some kind of simplistic utilitarian value. And I think the more radical artistic visions are the more difficult ones, are the more challenging ones that you kind of struggle with and grapple with, that don't yield themselves to any straightforward understanding or interpretation or the act of meaning making in some sense even, right? So I think that is what it is. And unfortunately today we're in a time where things are being, including art, are being utilized for utilitarian ends. And that is the worrying thing. So, yes, more radical, uh, more subversive ideas and practices of art, I think, is really what we need today.
And I suppose some of that also could tie into an alternative vision of even community-based support as opposed to reliance on institutions. I mean, even as there are some spaces, they of course function within the whole sort of neoliberal networks that have emerged post the 90s, even in contemporary or global art. Okay, so we had one more question from Aditya only. Wanted to sort of ask you if you could talk further about how you frame this section of artist as citizen in the context of your overall edited volume.
Yeah, sure. So it was actually a difficult and a very fun process, but sometimes frustrating process to work on the book. We did a lot of, experimental work around the design of the book, the use of images, and um, artists and filmmakers were very generous to say, allow us to kind of, if I may use the term, mess around with their work without being terribly precious about it. And that was very gracious, and I'm very, very thankful for that, as were authors who allowed us to edit down text. So I cut out 1,500 words from Geeta Kapoor's essay, and in another essay by Geeta Patel, which was a 14,000 word essay, I brought it down to about 2,000. So people have been very, very generous in kind of letting us use the material. The book has three sections, and because it is a book on the moving image, it doesn't stick to the definition of the moving image as the artist's moving image, uh, because of my location in South Asia and the way in which moving image cultures, histories have developed here. So it looks at popular film and documentary cinema and artist work all together. And that was actually one of the biggest challenges, a little bit like in Anamika Haksar's film of, how do you bring these very diverse image balances together, because they each have their own provenance, they have their own intention. And so one had to be very careful about that. The first section is actually cinema looking back at its own history in terms of trying to formulate its own historiography. The second section is artists as citizens. So I've kind of taken very deliberate decisions in putting the material together. For example, in the second section, I do focus on women's work, on women artists and women filmmakers, and that's really not to say that, you know. Significant or interesting or important work has not been produced by men, but this was a decision that I took. And the third section is looking at what happens to cinema after the 1990s, and cinema and art in its multiple mediated popular forms, and how people across the country start using it. So there's an article talking about the Purilia movement, the Manbhum language movement, and the demand for, distinctive cultural identity or claims towards a distinctive cultural identity. There is an essay on Telangana, and so on. And there's an essay on the questions around copyright and the, this kind of heightened anxiety to regulate the circulating digital image and so on. So that's how this section actually is the spine of the book. Section 2 is really what holds it together in many ways. So yeah.
One more small comment. Artists are social scientists and therefore citizens too. This was a comment by Suresh Nair. So I think just like perhaps another dimension to this idea of the artist citizen. So if an artist is, I suppose, a social scientist or producing certain responses to societal norms, then perhaps that. If there's any more questions, again, like terribly sorry.
I'm not sure that an artist is a social scientist, though. I would have to differ there. I think science, again, I mean, something that happens in controlled conditions, right, in a lab. And social science, as we know, is a myth at best, because society cannot be controlled, and so everything is erratic, and one has to maybe look at the idea of the event, as various theorists have written about it and so on, to see what causes transformations, upheavals in society, transformations. And I think social science is not the best equipped discipline, or sociology, to look at it. I think anthropologists, historians, philosophers have done a much better job of this. Writers, creative writers have too.
Since it is almost 7:30, I think we can conclude this session for now. Thank you so much again for the talk, Dr. Sawhney, and for these responses despite all of the tech glitches. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We will be sharing a recorded and edited version of the talk on our platform next week by next week. And please keep an eye out on our announcements in social media as we hope to have more such public events with hopefully fewer technical glitches in the future. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, and thank you to Art South Asia. And I'm really sorry about the tech glitches. Despite best intentions, technology never fails to fail you. Yes, Shiva, thank you for joining, and I look forward to a non-tech mediated meeting soon. Thank you all of you, and for patiently staying with us despite all these difficulties. Thanks.